Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's meeting, which is in a different venue for us. So I am aware that there has been some hold-up on the motorway, so not everybody's here at the moment, but we are quorate, so we're going to go ahead, and hopefully our colleagues can join us as and when. Okay, we have apologies from Councillors Eddy, Hulme, Moss, Thomas and James Mason, who's our independent person.
Just for avoidance of doubt, so the members we're expecting hopefully to join us as the meeting progresses: Councillors Goggin, Hardy, Saini, Tucker and Wilcox. So hopefully they will join us. Okay, and Councillor May. Thank you.
And I'll ask Simon to give us the emergency evacuation procedures.
Thank you, Chair. We're not expecting any fire alarm tests today, so if it does actuate, it is a real event. I can ask members and members of the public to leave the building, and the congregation area is to the left by the large tree on the left-hand side as you go outside the building. Thank you.
Thank you. I've had no declarations of interest advised. So take that. Item 4 is public access.
Thank you, Chair. So we didn't get any public access statements from the public. We have, however, received a statement from the Fire Brigades Union, which I will invite Amanda Mills to read to us. Thank you.
Hello. Chair, members of the Fire Authority, Amanda Mills speaking on behalf of the firefighters of Avon. By carrying out due diligence, the FBU acknowledges the uplift in the government grant as outlined in the budget papers. I quote the minutes of the October 2023 Fire Authority meeting. A member asked that if the forecasted funding was increased, could the Fire Authority delay or reverse these savings or put these savings into capital? The Chief Fire Officer advised that it was always prudent to review our financial situation when known and to work with the Fire Authority and trade unions. I put to you, members and Chair, that now is the time to review our financial situation. The increase in the revenue support grant of 2.4 million, as well as the locally retained business rates compensation grant of 2.2 million, should be utilised in such a way to halt the cutting of 40 firefighters. We are hugely behind in gathering risk information, so much so that it was an accelerated cause for concern in the most recent HMI report. This work is done by firefighters on frontline appliances. We cannot possibly address the HMI's concern by reducing the workforce. Although one of these grants is a one-off, what it does do is give the efficiencies team time to remedy the issues with the current crewing method. Issues which have caused high levels of overtime costs compared with other services. Currently sitting, we believe, at around £800,000. It provides time to identify other areas where savings can be made. It provides enough of a surplus to reverse the decision to cut 40 firefighters, especially when we now don't need to, in light of the additional grants. It was the view of this authority to only make these cuts as there was no other choice, but now there is. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll ask the Chief Fire Officer to respond.
I'd like to thank Amanda and the FBUE. Members, just to inform you, continue to work closely with Fire Brigades Union, Amanda and her colleagues, in speaking and addressing some of the challenges that we face going into the future. In relation to some of the points that Amanda's raised in her statement on behalf of the firefighters of Avon, they will be covered in the presentation of the various papers in the meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll now move on to item 5, Chair's business. And I'd like to welcome you all to a new venue. We're trying to move around and Unfortunately, it might have backfired slightly this morning because there's apparently a hold-up on the motorway, but I'm hoping the rest of our colleagues can join us as soon as possible. This meeting is taking place at Brook Activity Centre in Bradley, Stoke, for the benefit of the record. We're also recording the meeting for the public to view on the Fire Authority YouTube channel. And I'd like to ask members to introduce themselves, starting myself. My name is Brenda Massey. I'm Chair of the Fire Authority, and I'm a councillor in Southmead in Bristol. And which way have we got most members? Andrew, let's start yours.
Hey everyone, I'm Councillor Andrew Varney, representing Brislington West for Bristol City Council. Thank you.
I'm Councillor Jane Stansfield, Councillor for Thornbury in South Gloucestershire Council.
I'm Councillor Yasin Mahmood, Lawrence Hillward, Bristol City Council.
I'm Councillor Ron Karseni from Baines.
Mark Shelford, I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for Avon and also.
Councillor Liz Brennan for Frenchay and Downend for South Gloucestershire Council.
Good morning, Councillor Matthew Riddle. I represent the Severn Vale ward in South Gloucestershire. Thank you.
Good morning, Steve Smith, representing Westbury and Henleys on Bristol City Council.
Good morning, Councillor Ben Nutland, Yate North, South Gloucestershire Council and Vice Chair of the Fire Authority.
Thank you. And can I now ask the officers to introduce themselves, starting with the Chief Fire Officer?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. Good morning, members of the public. Simon Shilton, Chief Officer, Chief Exec. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Verity Lee, Statutory Finance Officer.
Good morning, Richard Welch, Assistant Chief Fire Officer.
And Claire Bentley, Head of Finance. Good morning, Angie Feeney, Director of Corporate Services, Avon Fire and Rescue Service.
Good morning, Emma Bowen, Democratic Services.
Yeah, good morning, members. Steve Imrie, one of the Assistant Chiefs.
Good morning, Amanda Brown, Clerk to Avon Fire Authority.
Thank you for that. And can I remind everybody here to put your phones on silent so we don't get any exotic ringtone turning up in the middle of our deliberations? Well, I could shout at you, Chris, and I have done in the past, and I can do it again, but I'll try and speak up a bit for you. Can I remind everybody to use the microphones, as I am, when speaking, and remember to turn them off when you've finished speaking. Any voting required will take place by asking members for a show of hands. It will be any votes against, any abstentions, and then votes for. I'd like to advise you as well that Councillor Karen Walker has left the Fire Authority from the 11th of January 2024. We wish her well and send our best wishes for the future. She's been replaced by Councillor Robin Moss, who we welcome to the Fire Authority, but unfortunately he's had to send his apologies today due to a commitment in Baines. I'm also sad to share the news that firefighter Chris Havisham of Bedminster Red Watch passed away in January following a short battle with lung cancer. As a mark of respect, I'd like to propose that members join me to hold a minute's silence to remember Chris. Thank you. I also need to report that on Friday, the 12th of January, firefighters attended a fire in Eastville in Bristol covering Lockleys and Ashley wards. The fire was one of a number of incidents that we had attended in the area, all of which were thought to have been started deliberately. Sadly, during the response to the fire, one of our firefighters was injured and was taken to hospital. They're now recovering at home with their family, and we send our best wishes to them. And I'd like to pass over to Simon, please.
Thank you, Chair. Since our last meeting, members, as a result of last year's HMIC inspection, members will be aware that we were moved into the engaged phase for the inspectorate, and the Chair, the Vice Chair and I attended our first fire performance and oversight group on the 7th of February, so earlier on this month, held in London. We were given an hour to present. I felt, though, we had a good story to tell. It took the full hour, in fact slightly more than that, to tell the story of some of the efforts and procedures and changes we'd made since the inspectorate. Bearing in mind they came into the service in summer of last year, so around about May and June of last year, although the report wasn't released until November. Immediately after the inspection, we had two accelerated cause of concern, one for the mobilising system and one for risk information, and then on the publication of the report in November, two further cause of concern, one around prevention and the second one, the fourth one being around values and culture. Very pleased to say positive feedback from the inspectorate on our direction of travel, and in fact have invited the inspectorate to revisit the service in March to look at the improvements we've made, in particular in relation to the mobilising system in such a short space of time, in the hope that they will give due consideration to discharging that cause of concern, given all of the interventions and the commitment that the authority have made in a £2.5 million investment in upgrading the technical refresh of the whole system. I don't know whether the Chair would like to offer any observations.
I'm very pleased that we are taking all the issues that were raised very seriously, and everybody is working really hard to change the outcome. And I think it shows that they were very pleased with what you'd got so far. So that was quite a positive meeting, I think. Yeah. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Okay, item 6.1, minutes of the ordinary meeting of Avon Fire Authority held on the 4th of October 2023. And I'd like to move that they should be accepted as a true record. Thank you, Ben. Right.
Yeah. I just wonder if I could ask a question on the minutes. It's an observation, and I don't have a page number, but it's part of the report from the Policy and Resources Committee minutes of the 27th of July 2023. And
we're coming to those minutes in a second, if that's all right. You're talking about committee minutes, yes?
Again?
Committee minutes,
Yes, correct.
Can we do the Fire Authority ones first, just get them passed, and then I'll come back to you if that's all right. So you proposed the minutes, yep. I think Councillor Nutland has seconded. Can we have any votes against or any abstentions? Votes in favour? Thank you. Do you want to do the extraordinary ones as well?
We also have, under item 6.2, minutes of the extraordinary meeting of Avon Fire Authority held on the 13th of December 2023. And I move those are a correct record. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. Okay.
Votes in favour? Oh, sorry. Yes? Is it? Sorry, I missed that. I was answering a question. So who proposed and who seconded?
I proposed them and you seconded.
Oh, thank you so much. That's brilliant.
We won't jump ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Everyone in favour? Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, it was me not paying attention. Okay.
Right. Item 7.1 Which one was it, Mark, that you had a problem with? Or you wanted?
It's not a problem, it's an observation. Say 27th of July 23,
Okay,
Policy and Resources
let's get
Committee.
the one just before that out of the way. We're taking them on bulk. All right.
They've already been approved.
They've been approved, yeah.
So which page do you know?
I don't have a page, but I have it's number 13.
Okay, let me find
It's a
it.
section on gender pay gap and ethnic pay gap reporting.
Yes, found it. Page 41, members.
So I was surprised by this piece in that since it's completely transparent, why is there any pay gap at all? Either because you're male or female, or because you're from a different race.
It's not quite as simple as that, unfortunately. I will send you the link to the paper. It's a report we publish every year. We're required to by statute because we employ, I think, more than 250 employees. And there are national statistics on the pay gap. So the pay gap does still exist, but it's normally because there are not enough females at the higher ranks. So it's normally the fact that it's skewed a bit by the representation of females rather than the pay itself. But anyway, I can send you the link to the paper if that will help answer your question.
Yes, thank you. Just to be clear though, if you're doing the same job, whether you're male or female, you get paid the same?
Yes.
And irrespective of what race you are, you get paid the same?
Yes.
I think that's quite important to state, even if it's done by the number of people and therefore averaging out, there seems to be a pay gap because there are no senior women or few senior women or few senior people from different ethnic minorities. I accept that, but I think it's quite clear that you should be publicly saying you get paid the same irrespective of your background.
I think the report probably does say that, but I can't remember the details, so I'll need to send you a link to the actual report that the committee considered. It's the same report that they get every year, so it's a requirement by statute that we have that report in our agenda, so I'll make sure you see that. And if it doesn't make that clear, I'll suggest that for the next one. Thank you. Thank you.
I can assure you, Mark, we certainly wouldn't be discriminating against anybody in terms of race, gender, age, or anything else. I'd be extremely unhappy if I found out that was happening anywhere, and I'm sure it isn't. So I hope that gives you some confidence. Right, so we only need to note these minutes. That's items 7.1 to 7.4, taking them all together because they've already been approved by the relevant committees as accurate. And I'll now move on to item 8, which is the 2024-25 budget setting and precept, and the Statutory Finance Officer and Head of Finance are going to present those for us.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is paper 8, which is page 67 of your bundles. This is the first of 4 finance papers this morning, and this one specifically focuses on the next financial year, so the 2024-25 financial year, in terms of budget setting and precept setting. The purpose of this paper really is to outline the budget position and agree what the precept is for the coming year. We have set out 2 options within this paper. Option 1 is an increase in council tax of 2.99%, and option 2 is no increase in council tax precept. There are 6 recommendations of this report, which are included at paragraph 2.1 at the bottom of page 67 and then the top of page 68. I won't go through them in detail now because I think we'll go through them individually as we approve the paper. Just by way of background, we as a fire authority are a precepting authority, so we are required to set and approve our budget by the 1st of March each year in advance of the coming financial year. So that's what we're doing here today, and it then allows our unitary authority, so the billing authority, to then meet their budget setting deadlines. Because the papers are quite long today, I'm going to try to just pick out what I think are the key points to note. So I'm going to move on to section 5 and the key considerations of this paper, which are on page 69. On the 19th of December last year, the local government funding settlement was announced for the 2024-25 financial year, and there are a few elements of that I wanted to pick out today. So paragraph 5.2 talks about the formula grant funding and the revenue support grant. So table A at the bottom of that page shows you how the revenue support grant and the business rate top-up grants have moved year on year. So that top revenue support grant has been increased by 6.7%. That's a CPI increase. and is increased by CPI each year. So that's an increase that we would expect to see. Business rates top-up grant hasn't moved. And then the 2.4 million that we can see at the bottom of that table is additional revenue support grant. So it's previously a pension grant. So that's a grant that the FBU mentioned earlier on for us this morning. That isn't actually additional funding year on year. We had that funding last year, but it wasn't rolled up within the revenue support grant. So it's not new funding. It's not additional for this year. It's the same as we had in 2023-24. It's just been put in a different pot. Paragraph 5.3 talks about our services grant element, and actually that's reduced by around 350k when compared to 2023-24. And then if we move over to paragraph 5.4 on page 70, the last bullet point here really is the most important one. So our 3% referendum limit for fire and rescue authorities. So that's our council tax precept limit, which is where we are, why we are proposing option 1 of the 2.99% precept increase for next year. Moving on to page 71, we can just have a little look at council tax base. So our council tax income for the year as a fire service is kind of made up of two components, the tax base and then the amount of precept, so the combination of the two. So this table just shows you how the tax base is moving year on year, and the tax base being the number of properties that are paying council tax within our unitary authorities. You can see here that overall across the 4 unitary authorities we've got an increase of 1.8% in tax base, so that alone will generate us around an additional £600,000 just under of income for the year. That is quite an unusually high increase, and we can see that Bristol City Council have got just under 4% increase for the year, and that's because of a change in the way that the council tax is being collected within Bristol City Council. Normally we'd expect that to be slightly lower, but just to pull out that that's been a benefit for us this year. And then moving on to the options appraisal. So the 2 options that I mentioned earlier on in this paper. So option 1 is the increase of 2.99% on the precept. That equates to £2.48 for a Band D property for us, and brings our Band D council tax up to £85.43 for the next financial year. If we look at option 2, which is no increase in council tax, this, just to put it into a little bit of context, would reduce our income when compared to option 1 by around £960,000, so just under £1 million lower income we would generate if we had no council tax increase when we compare the 2 options. Paragraph 5.11 is just a paragraph to kind of clarify that we've presented 2 options here for you today. That doesn't mean that they're the only 2 options, and it just clarifies that we could consider alternatives, for example, a 1.99% increase in precept, and how that would impact us. So we've just seen that the 3% or 2.99% equates to around 960,000. So we're looking at, if we reduced that by 1% to 1.99%, we'd see a 300k impact on the revenue budget. So just to put that in a little bit of context. Moving on just to precept consultation. So page 73 of your bundles has a section there on the precept consultation. I thought it was just important to bring out the information in paragraph 5.17. So the precept consultation was run in conjunction with the service plan consultation, so that started in December, and as at the 31st of January we pulled out the results just to see, just specifically for the consultation elements that were related to the financials. So we had 274 responses, and of those, 75% of those responses were either agreeing or strongly agreeing that the service provided value for money, and then 73% of those responses agreed or strongly agreed with option 1 of this report, so the 2.99% precept increase. If I then move on to page 74 of your bundles, paragraph 5.19, so this talks about the locally retained business rates and the compensation that again, the FBU mentioned earlier, so the 2.2 million, that is a non-guaranteed funding, so it comes via a Section 31 grant, so we cannot assume that it continues into the future. But the important point to note there is that actually last year we had 2.5 million, this year we're being told 2.2 million, so that's slightly lower than we had last year, so again, not necessarily an increase year on year in that area. Oh, something I meant to mention at the beginning of this paper, at the top of this, so at the top of table F, there's a typo that I wanted to just note for the minutes. The 2023-24 financial year, it should state 2024-25. So just note that for the minutes, so we'll get that amended. What I wanted to move on to next was kind of the construction of the budget and the other assumptions that we've made. So we've covered income assumptions. And then if we move on to paragraph 5.22 at the bottom of page 74, it talks about other assumptions that we've made within that budget, the budget setting process. So any other income streams for the service have been assumed level with prior year, unless we know any different. And then we can move on to expenditure assumptions. So with regards to non-pay, we've assumed a 3% CPI increase year on year compared to 2023-24. That is outside of anything that that has a known increase. So if we know that, for example, the audit fee we know is set by a scale fee via the PSAA, so that will be included in the budget at the value that we know. Anything that we are not sure of has been inflated by 3%. In terms of pay budget, so for 2024-25, we've assumed a pay award of 4%, and that's been reflected in the numbers that you can see today. The final two bullet points at the top of page 75, so the two dark bullet points there, are some specific assumptions we've made in generating the budget for 2024-25. The first one is around a contribution from revenue to capital. So we're proposing to contribute £500,000 from the revenue budget into our capital reserve. The reason for doing this is to try to help to reduce and defer the requirement to borrow. So we'll see as we come on to later papers, particularly the capital programme and the medium-term financial plan, we have got a significant amount of capital investment that's required within the service. And in order to fund that investment, our reserves are running down and we will need to take on borrowing over the coming years. By contributing this £500,000, we're hoping to shift the borrowing so that it's not required in 2024-25, so it's pushing it into the 25-26 financial year, and slightly reducing that level of borrowing as well. I think members should recall, and as part of the minutes that have been approved earlier on today, we had a Policy and Resources Committee meeting in December where a business case was approved for a mobilisation system upgrade. That mobilisation system upgrade had both a revenue and capital element of the business case, and the capital element, it was highlighted as part of that approval that there wasn't sufficient funding within the current capital programme, which was approved in February last year, to fund that. So this 500,000 also helps to kind of bridge that gap there and increase the capital programme to help us fund that business case. And then the final point I wanted to talk about is the £440,000 contribution from revenue towards costs that are required to deliver the HMIC FRS action plan. So in order for us to implement our action plan, we know there are going to be costs associated with that. So we have identified a number of costs which are highlighted for you here today. So some money for increasing the broadband speeds in the stations. Now that is a revenue cost and it will be ongoing. And what we'll do is baseline it into the budget in future years, but it's highlighted here separately for you today. We've put £150,000 aside for additional IT investment, so things like mini PCs, developments of people dashboards. There's a lot of IT investment that's required as a result of the HMIC action plan. There's £180,000 specifically for resource, so resource that we require to ensure that we've got the governance and monitoring in place to deliver our action plan. And then £50,000 as well for culture and value improvement, so things like training. So if we move on to paragraph 5.23, goes across 2 pages towards and finishes on page 76. And what I really wanted to highlight here was that paragraph is talking about how the 2024-25 revenue budget compares to the 23-24 budget, and where we've seen increases in income, but also more increases in expenditure. So we're seeing a requirement still to make efficiency savings. So those efficiency savings are currently sitting at around 625,000. Based on option 1, so should the 2.99% precept option be approved. Those efficiency savings are lower than have been previously presented. So when we presented the medium-term financial plan last year, they were sitting at around £1 million. And as the financial year progressed, so during 2023, we looked at how they might be increasing because inflation rates were going up. But having seen inflation starting to drop, we've seen the council tax base come in slightly higher. We've been able to reduce these savings slightly, so we're looking at £600,000. What that means is we can start to more gradually introduce our efficiency savings plan. But as we come on to the following paper, so the second paper I'll present to you today is the medium-term financial plan, and we can see there that actually there are still significant savings that are required across the 4 years in order to balance the budget. So it's a case of a more gradual approach rather than being required to do it. The next section of this paper, actually probably the best thing to do now, we'll look at the appendix, and then we can see how the numbers look. So if I can draw your attention to Appendix 2, which is page 83 of your bundles. And the first column in this appendix is the prior year approved budget. So that's the 2023-24 approved budget, just to give you something by way of a comparison. The middle column is budget for 2024-25 under option 1, so that's the 2.99% precept increase. And then the final column is option 2 for the 24-25 budget, so a 0% precept increase. So the key lines I just wanted to draw your attention to. So that very first line under section A, income from councils. Under option 1, we can see around £38 million of income. Under option 2, you can see that's dropping to 37.1 million. So that's where that £900,000 difference between the two options can be seen. And if we move right down to the bottom of the page, all of the other lines across this budget have the same underpinning assumptions. And we move right down to the bottom just to see the impact of that reduced income from council tax into section 5. And the second line down is the efficiency savings line. So we can see under option 1 a £625,000 requirement for efficiency savings under option 1, which I mentioned earlier. But under option 2, that efficiency savings number increases to over 1.5 million, and that's because of the impact of the £900,000. So £900,000 less income means we need to spend £900,000 less, so we need to find more savings. The lines following the efficiency saving line are those specific items I mentioned earlier, so the revenue contribution to capital and those HMIC FRS costs that we've identified that need to be incurred, just to make them visible there for you as well. And then if I move back to the main body of the report, and page 76, so the section 25 statement. So something we're legally required to do, and I'm legally required to do as a section 151 officer, is make a statement on the robustness of the budget and the adequacy of the level of reserve. So that's what this statement is here for you today. So I won't regurgitate it all, but I will just point out that we've got an appendix which highlights, in Appendix 3, highlighting the risks that have been identified as part of the budget setting process, and then the mitigations that have been identified as well. So that's included within the appendix for you today. And then moving on to adequacy of level of reserves, we have got an appendix. So Appendix 4 shows you what the reserves position is expected to be like as at the end of March 2024, which will be the opening position for the 24-25 financial year. So that's shown on page 87. So we can see just under 11 million, so 10.8 million of reserves are expected to be in place at the end of March 2024. Just over 5 million of that is capital related. The reserve that's important in terms of adequacy of level of reserves is the general reserve, so it's our working balance really. So there's 1.5 million there. That is to aid our kind of ups and downs in our cash flow fluctuations across the financial year, and we're always required to top that back up. That represents around 12 days worth of spending for the service, and we haven't had to duck into that reserve in recent years, so we've been very fortunate. And there's a statement to that effect within the Section 25 report here. And I think that kind of brings me to all I really wanted to say about the budget. I mean, the budget we presented for you here today is based on sound principles and based on the best information we have available to us at this point in time, in order to try and make a prudent assessment of where we think next year, where we think our finances will end up next year. And I'd like to open up for any questions.
Thank you, Verity. Right, David first, and Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the report. I'd like to talk about Appendix 2, and particularly the line income from central government. How is that actually calculated from government, and is there any recognition from central government that the area's population is increasing and we have more people to cover? Please.
So within those figures, we've got estimates from central government for the grants that we've received, but also within the local government agreement, they confirmed that there would be a minimum funding level. So they have agreed to top up that funding, and Avon did receive around about 600k in the draft statement to take into account those changes. So yes, that has been recognised in there.
The calculation to work out individual authorities' revenue support grants is also very complex based on a number of factors: rural, residential areas, population, coastal areas, and all sorts of different aspects. To try and explain that to me, to you, would be really complex because I don't fully kind of understand all of the different complexities that they put into that, but it's applied to all authorities. There's been some research been undertaken for quite some time now that the outcome hasn't yet been reached around reviewing the calculations of how the revenue support grant for each authority is worked out based on population and other, I guess, other complex unique aspects for each individual authority area. So I'd love to be able to sit and explain it to Councillor, but it's very, very in-depth in terms of how they do it.
Thank you for that. Yes, I would understand it's suitably arcane. And I do note that in the budget proposal, it's 14.8 million, and in the midterm financial plan, it's 15.3 million, I think, or something like that. So it is growing. I just wondered if there was any layman's way of actually estimating about how it actually might grow so that we can plan.
If we're talking about specifically the revenue support grant, then for the last 2 years, we've seen an increase on that particular figure in line with the September previous year CPI. So that's what we've assumed going forward, but obviously those are also based on assumed inflation figures. We are aware that if there is a change to the calculation of the funding, then it could be that it will be a completely different number. So what we've done is we've based it on the revenue support grant that we've been notified of, and then an assumption in terms of a sensible inflation figure going forward, which we've included at 3%. For the future years in the medium-term financial plan. So that's where you'll see it moving.
Thank you.
Steve?
Yeah, thank you, Verity, for that. Clear and helpful as ever, I think. I think I'll say straight away, in terms of the two options that you propose for precept, that's a very easy decision for me. 2.99 is less than inflation, it's less than our costs have gone up by. And if we don't do it this year, it just bakes in that bigger deficit for the future. So I'm seeing lots of nodding heads around the room, so hopefully that's not a difficult decision for us. I've just got a couple of clarifications and one challenge, then, if I may. There's a line when it talks about how the budget is built up. It's based on last year, or current year's outturn from September, I think it was. And then there's an addition in there of 1.7 million for calculating pay costs based on establishment. Does that mean that we're currently, or in September, we were carrying £1.7 million worth of vacancies that we expect to fill in the next year? And how does that square against the efficiency savings? I just don't quite understand that line.
It's been a slight change in the way we've been calculating the costs associated with establishment, and the way we've done it. So in the past, we've talked about overtime briefly as well this morning. We've had vacancies within establishment, and then we've had overtime costs that kind of offset that. What we've done in terms of building the budget this year is assumed that the pay costs are linked to the establishment. So the positions the people that should be in post based on permanent substantive roles. I don't know if that.
Okay, but if that is £1.7 million higher than the current outturn, that's saying we're going to spend 1.7, regardless of pay inflation or anything else, we're going to spend £1.7 million more on pay on people in next year than we did this year. And I don't understand where that 1.7 million comes from, especially when we're also then talking about taking out a chunk of people, which I'll come to in a minute.
Yeah, so I don't know if Claire wants to add in terms of the detail of the calculation.
So in terms of how we've previously calculated the pay budget, what we've done is we've adjusted for things like where we've got expected retirements and also for people coming back in. But what we haven't done is include those expected retirements in that pay figure, because what we're expecting is that actually that'll contribute to the efficiency savings. So if we were to take that off the pay figure, then we'd actually be counting it twice if we put those efficiencies in there. So it's actually just a change in how we've presented it rather than change in how we make that calculation, because actually our retirements on the firefighter side are around about 1 to 1.5 million a year. So, and that's based on kind of an average. So that's where we've got that change, is most of it is actually where we haven't adjusted for those pensioners coming out of that pay figure, because we're expecting that to then be recognised in terms of efficiencies going forward.
Okay, I'm going to have one more go at this because I still don't quite get it, so apologies for harping on here. But we're not, as I understand it, we're not saying it's 1.7 million more than what we calculated last year. We're saying it's 1.7 million more than we are actually spending. It's the outturn plus 1.7 million is what the report says, I think. So regardless of what calculations were made last year, if it's calculated differently, what we're saying here is we are we're expecting to spend 1.7 million more than we actually spent, or are actually spending in the current year, at least at September's forecast. So what you're saying is we're calculating it differently, but I don't understand where the extra £1.7 million comes from.
Well, we are expecting to fill vacancies that we're carrying, but also, like I say, that 600k or 625k will net off that figure, so it's around about £1 million. And actually, in terms of additional posts, that's not, if you look at it over a whole year, that's not actually very many when we look at the total costs of people. So it is around those vacancies that we're expecting to fill, and we're also, we know we've got some key corporate services posts coming up that need to be filled in 24-25 that we haven't previously had. So there are some additional posts in there as well, but it is also that it's netting off somewhere else, so it's also to do with how we're presenting it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I'll move on to that netting off then, those efficiencies. I just want to clarify one thing. I think the report talks about 700,000, and that being 14 firefighter posts, average of 50k per post. And then in the table and in your narrative, Verity, you talked about 625,000. Can I just clarify exactly what that number is and how many posts that is and how it compares? Because previously we looked at efficiency plans, and this, I'm assuming this is the riding fours not instead of riding fives thing. We've talked about up to 40 posts being involved in that before, so what is the number that's proposed now and how is that delivered?
I think very much it's related to the not just this current next year's financial deficit or efficiencies that we need to make, but over the medium-term financial plan, which Verity will cover in the next papers as well. What it enables to is actually, as Verity said there, is that you're right, it's about a £50,000 cost to the authority per firefighter post if we're talking about a firefighter's salary as an example. So therefore any efficiencies would be able to divide that by what it would cost the authority. Given that it's now showing a decrease in the funding deficit than what we were originally predicting or expecting as a result of some of the funding streams that we've been able to achieve, in particular the additional funding that Claire referenced, enables us really to consider any efficiencies in a more phased approach, but it has to be over the medium-term financial plan, not just the in-year as well, which will obviously be highlighted a little bit later on in relation to any reduction in salary costs, an example, to meet those efficiency savings.
Okay, thanks. So it is 625 this year, but that's the start of a longer programme. So we're talking, on average, if it happened in April, that would be 12 to 13 posts. Presumably there's a time delay, so it's more posts, but for part of the year as we go through. Okay.
It does allow us to look at our retirement profile as well, so we can do that through a natural, I guess, reduction of headcount or salaries, the cost of salaries, as opposed to any more alternative approaches. So that's we'll talk about the phased approach to any efficiencies that we need to find.
Okay, fine. Thank you. In that case, I'll come on to my challenge and then I'll shut up and let someone else have a go. The challenge, there's one maybe for colleagues to think about, and if I'm out on my own on this, I'll pipe down. But we've got 500k from revenue going into capital this year, and I appreciate we've got a lot of planned investment, or at least potential of planned investment. And over the next 4 years, we're looking to borrow, I think the figure's 28.6 million. And I accept there's fair margin of error on that because it's schemes that haven't necessarily been approved yet. This 500k going into the capital reserve reduces, or if we didn't do this, we'd have to borrow 29.1 million instead of 28.6 million. Doesn't seem like a huge difference. And I expect, every penny counts, and 8% of whatever that is hits future years' revenue budget. So that's a difference of 40k per year in future years' revenue budgets. My challenge is that worth losing whatever that number might be, firefighter posts this year, in order to save ourselves £500,000 worth of borrowing against a total of nearly 30?
I take your point. It's a small number in the grand scheme of the total borrowing. I think the logic was around pushing that borrowing into the following financial year to try and take advantage of lower interest rates. Cost of borrowing is high, and when we come on to medium-term financial plan, we can see that cost of borrowing is significant as the years go out, and you're right, and a small element of a big number anyway. I guess the the way we would take out borrowing, I don't think we would be able to just take out £500,000 in a given year. We would be taking out a more significant amount. So we would be taking out a larger amount of borrowing associated with the projects that we're planning, and having to take that out at an earlier date, which might well be more of an impact than just the £500,000 in terms of interest. So I think it was the logic of just trying to push it to the right as far as possible to take advantage of that interest rate and overall reduce it. Again, it's a small number, but I guess it is that every little helps. I don't know if you wanted to add.
Okay. So I think either way, we're probably delaying the inevitable. We either delay borrowing a little bit, or if we don't do that this year and we keep those posts, we're probably just delaying inevitable efficiencies. I think personally I would rather delay the efficiencies than delay the borrowing, but I'll see what colleagues think about that.
Anyone else want to comment? Questions? Yes.
Yeah, just to add short on what Councillor said, we need to make sure that we need to keep this efficiency, because as you know, the Lawrence Hill Ward, one of the abbreviators of Bristol City Council, we use a lot of your service and we leave your service, so we need to make sure these positions to keep it and to look alternative options to keep this member of your staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start off by congratulating the authority, the force, the service in the responses to the budget questions that you've received already. A great, overwhelming support that you are providing value for money, and that in turn gives me confidence to support 2.99 as well. As Steve said, it's below inflation. We've got to keep on investing in the service for the long term. If we give up for one year, that will have a knock-on effect for the years down the line. So I'm very happy with 2.99, but there is a challenge for me as well. If we'd gone for zero, then efficiency savings would need to be greater. And my challenge is, even though we're going for 2.99, well, I would support 2.99, we always must be looking for efficiency savings. I'm sure you are, because new technologies come along, new ways of working come along, and so we need to keep our eyes open to looking on the horizon for efficiency savings, because in the long run that should provide a better service for our public, but also better working conditions, for example, for our staff. So that's my challenge in supporting 2.99. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. We do have, obviously, our efficiency plans, and we're always trying to make sure we're spending the money in the right place where we need to. The presentation of the budget for next year, obviously, in terms of the budget provisions, are, in essence, trying to find or give space for further research around those necessary efficiencies that need to be taken, and also not necessarily compress a time frame where it has a greater impact when we find ourselves in a bigger funding deficit, of course, which over a shorter time frame for us to be able to plan or apply those necessary efficiencies, which run the risk of pushing not being able to achieve the efficiencies within a financial year, as an example. But we have looked at a number of ways of how we can find efficiencies, knowing that this has been a potential on the horizon perhaps for the last two or 3 years, and now it's become a reality. Now we know that we obviously got our budget announcement and our funding streams as well. So we've always had options available to us. One of the ones that we've presented to the authority last September was one of those options to try and address some of the efficiencies. So we're constantly looking at that, and that's a real difficult balance to be had when we also need to have investments in the service as well. We've heard this morning on several references to the HMIC, disappointing HMIC report on the service last year. Of course, to address those areas from the HMIC, there's going to need to be require investment in the service. So that's a really difficult balance to be had around not only recognising we have efficiency savings, but also recognising that we need to invest in the service to make necessary improvements that's been identified. And ICT being one is a huge challenge to the service, and one that constantly needs investment all the time to maintain and keep up with the pace of change. But also, the service very much now, modern day life, relies very heavily on ICT. We've heard about our mobilising system, which is an ICT-based system. We've also heard about our risk information, which is an ICT-based system that we need to constantly invest in, and that's where we've been trying to find the most efficiencies to get the best value for the authority's money.
Just two comments, really. Verity, fantastic report, as usual. I don't know if you can speak to this a little bit, but obviously interest rates are dropping, so that obviously when we do go out into the market to hopefully take on some, take on loans and capital spending, just because interest rates are dropping doesn't always mean you're going to get the same interest rate commercially available. And obviously, for some of the colleagues that have mentioned in terms of either bringing efficiency savings or maybe kicking it down the road a little bit, we have to be very careful that that isn't always the option. There are different shades of grey, and that actually when you do go out to the market to borrow, just because there are low interest rates doesn't mean that you'll get a naturally low interest rate in terms of what you're borrowing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we come on to the Treasury Management paper at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about interest rates and the forecast of where they are. But you're right, they're just a forecast. And when we go out to take on borrowing, we usually go with Public Works Loan Board. But that might not necessarily reflect the interest rates that are out commercially as well. So you're absolutely.
Any other comments? Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, just going back to you were talking about hiring more staff and at corporate level. Can you just clarify what sort of that projection is and what kind of staff you're talking about there in that figure?
One of the areas that we've identified as a necessity for the organisation is head of ICT. It's one that we've, over recent years, have always contracted out, and perhaps an area that perhaps reason why we find ourselves with a little bit behind the curve is we have had nobody sort of dedicated to that particular role. So that's one of the corporate roles that we've identified as a requirement and a necessity for the service, and also a number of other roles that we've had to fill vacancies as well. So, I don't want to add any more to that, team.
No, that's the key one. I think it's when you hear corporate as well, you do think, oh, that's just on the business side of the organisation. But corporate staff, of course, are also in community fire safety and in business fire safety. And business fire safety is another one where we're investing in kind of green book staff in that area. So it's the kind of things that we've spoken to members about before in terms of where we need to invest both for HMI and some of the areas identified through that process.
I've got Robert first. Robert, and then we go round.
Yes, thank you. The paper's presented to us as though we've got options here, but realistically, I don't think we have got any option. We have to go for the maximum precept rise that we can, because of the financial squeeze that we find ourselves in. We're continually cutting, and we just don't have sufficient resources to do what we need to do. I can't say I'm particularly happy with the 2.99% because I think really we need more than that. But obviously we can't go over that. So I think we have no option really but to go for option one. So that's the only thing available to us.
Right. Cool.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's sensible for us to propose the option one, because quite simply, if you don't, then next year you then got to make up that difference again. it's a hard fact of life in terms of the public that we serve, but I think we've got no choice but to go for option one. I do support Councillor Smith, his view around the capital money taken from the contribution to the capital reserves, because we've made an assumption around the 4%, and I would suggest that we keep the £500,000, if you like, as a contingency fund in case that changes in any way or not. And if that then saves people's jobs, then I think we should be prepared to make that decision this morning. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mark.
On the head of IT, I was just wondering whether there was an opportunity to work together with the police and perhaps work closer between your IT branch and my IT branch, rather than necessarily you having to go out and hire a whole new head of IT.
We have looked at a number of options, including I'm currently working with Hampshire and Isle of Wight to, in particular, look at models, because this is a head of ICT rather than a team around. So what we're looking at is different models to how that do that team around. So I have had those discussions, including in particular with kind of fire services, because that's where the main kind of crossover is. So I am speaking to colleagues both in Devon, Somerset and Hampshire and Isle of Wight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If central government actually gets its finger out and actually delivers the emergency services network, is there flexibility in the budget to actually use it?
No. So any funding we receive for emergency services network is ring-fenced, particularly for that. And in fact, we've had to give some back. Well, it's held regionally. So it's normally held at the moment, managed by the Statutory Finance Officer for Gloucester County Council for a region. We have had some part funding to fund a post, but there's been a little bit of a pause in the activity around ESN, but we can't utilise that funding for anything else. It is ring-fenced specifically for that, and we have to provide regular reports back into the Home Office of how we've utilised that budget and for what purpose.
Any other comments before we... Yeah.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to make a proposal, if I may, just to sort of test where colleagues are on what a couple of us have spoken about. So I would like to propose that we accept the budget with option one, with the 2.99 in it, but with the amendment that we take out the 500k to capital and subsequently reduce the efficiency savings by the same amount. And if people aren't with me on that, then we'll move on. But
I second that, Chair.
Any other comments on that proposal? No, you can't. You can't speak, Chris.
Is that? I just want something explained.
I'm sorry, you haven't presented a public access statement, so that was the opportunity to speak at the beginning of the meeting.
I just wondered what Councillor Smith said. Explain, that's all.
I'm afraid we need to move on. We've got some very complicated papers here today. Sorry, did you? Yeah.
Sorry, just for me, could we just explain that? This is my first time doing this at the Fire Authority, so I'd be grateful for that to be clarified.
happy to clarify what I'm proposing is that at the moment the budget proposes that we take £500 from the revenue budget and put that into capital to spend on investments in the future. What I'm proposing is that we don't do that, and that means that £500,000 remains available, and we don't need to make, instead of having to make £625,000 worth of savings, that would leave us only having to make £125,000 worth of efficiency savings in the current year. That doesn't change where the future goes, but in the current year it reduces the savings we'd need to make.
Does that mean no job cuts?
I think we're going to just give us a moment while we work out.
I've got two hands up, so I've got Councillor Nutland and Councillor Stansfield. So Councillor Nutland, you were first.
Obviously, I agree with Councillor Smith actually, but at the same time, we need to. This is an actual proper proposal, so we need to think through it and actually be able to give the committee all the information it needs in terms of operational, in terms of the finance suggestion from the officers. Can I suggest that we take a quick 5-minute break and let us actually let the officers go through this properly, and then we can give, actually give, some basic questions to them once they come back, so we get a better understanding. Because I'd rather make the right decision and take a little bit longer doing it than do a hasty decision and then find out we make the wrong decision later on down the road. So can I propose that, Chair? Happy to second that.
Good call.
I think that's...
Let's just see what Councillor Stansfield wanted to say. I'm sorry.
I'm just thinking on that point, because having read all the papers, it seems to me that whether or not we do this year, we'd still have to do it the following year. So it's just pushing an inevitable back by a year as opposed to actually really making a significant difference. Is that correct?
So, Chair, are you happy to go with the proposal that we adjourn for 5 minutes, just so that officers can consider that proposal which has been put, so we can see what impact that would have on figures?
I do appreciate it's a complicated business working through this, so I think it wouldn't hurt to have a short break in any case, regardless, so you can get your heads around it, because it's not the most straightforward of things. So,
can I suggest a quick comfort break there until 10 past 11, and can please everyone be seated again at 10 past 11? Thank you. So we're starting the meeting again at 11:15 for the benefit of the recording. I'm just going to update where we are following discussions with officers and with members, and I think we may have reached a consensus of what to do about the proposal which is on the table. So the proposal is that we consider one line in the budget, and the one line in the budget is the contribution from revenue to capital. So everything else in the budget appears to be, so it's just that one line. But the problem is that one line affects the other financial papers that you're looking at today. So there's a read across. So the proposal that we've discussed is that members would be asked to consider the precept figure today, which I think we seem to have a relatively good consensus on. So we get the vote done on that today. The remainder of the budget will have to be postponed and reconsidered at your next Fire Authority meeting, which is, Emma will look at me if I got this wrong, 20th of March, which is before the start of the financial year, so that's quite lucky that is timed perfectly. And we will then re-look at that line of the budget and what the consequences would be of not including that line. And what we're going to withdraw from the agenda is the capital programme. So the capital programme is currently at item 10. Because the capital programme is entirely based on what we're spending that capital on. And we can't set out those figures with you with as much confidence if we don't know if there's going to be that contribution to capital. So I'm proposing that paper is postponed until your March meeting with the reconsideration of the impact of that line of the budget. We are still going to go ahead with the medium-term financial plan. There is one line in an appendix, and I think what Verity can do is take you through the remainder of the paper, and we can update that appendix as needed at the next meeting. So I think there's still a reason to go through that if members are happy. So I'm hoping that reaches everybody's consensus, but I'll open the floor now to any comments or questions about that proposal.
So just before we broke up, I asked whether or not this was inevitable. So with your proposal to delay, I'll get my answer more nuanced in the next meeting. Is that right?
Yes, and in much more detail, because the analysis will be done on the impact of not making that contribution to capital, if that's what members wanted to consider. Shall we then have a re-look at the recommendations of the paper? Because I think one in particular will need to come out. So if I take you to page 67 of your bundle, so the Fire Authority is asked to consider the information contained in the report, that's fine. Agree a revenue budget, I think we take out. And instead, we say we agree a Band D council tax level for 24-25. And then C, agree that the Fire Authority's basic amount of council tax for 2024-25, and I'm going to propose for you to vote on option 1, which is the 2.99%. The reason I'm suggesting we go for that one first is because there appears to be a bit of consensus in the room. If you vote against it, we obviously vote on option 2. And then over the page, on page 68, make the statutory determinations in Appendix 1 based on the 2 options contained. So you're basically saying, yes, we're going for an option, which means we have a balanced budget. E, you agree that the precepts are then issued to the local authorities in proportion to the council tax bases, and then note the council tax, which would be under option 1 if you vote for it. So is everybody happy with that proposal? Okay, all right. Chair, would you like to propose?
It's the most exciting meeting we've had for a long time, all about finance. You wait till we get to our budget meeting in Bristol this week. Can't be so bad. Yeah, tomorrow. Okay, so you've heard the comments, the very helpful comments from Amanda on this, and the proposal as she has laid out here. Do we need to take one by one?
I think to ask for a seconder.
Yeah, I was going to do that, but right, okay. Anybody like to second the proposals?
Councillor
Yes,
Mohammed?
thank you.
And if it makes sense, it might be worth voting on all of the recommendations rather than individually. Let's vote on option 1, and then if we don't get over that, then we can come back and vote on option 2.
So, anybody against the proposal? Anybody abstaining? And those in favour? It's unanimous.
It's unanimous.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Great.
So the next paper is paper 9, which is the medium-term financial plan. So I'll hand over to the Statutory Finance Officer.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll still present this one for you today. As Amanda's mentioned, there is a line in there which is around capital financing costs, and that will change if we change the capital programme. So what I think we might do is change the recommendation to be noting this, so we can go through the key assumptions, and then what we'll do is approve the medium-term financial plan in the March Fire Authority meeting once we have made a decision on what the 2024 revenue budget looks like. So to take you through this paper, so we are required by the Fire and Rescue National Framework to prepare a medium-term financial plan. Our financial plan is covering a 4-year period, so from the year 2024-25 to 2027-28. Recommendations shown in there under paragraph 2.1, we'll amend that approve to noting for today. What I wanted to do actually is just move straight on to section 5 of the paper, and particularly table 1 on top of page 91, which talks about the funding assumptions. So we'll just talk briefly around the assumptions that have been made in the medium-term financial plan. So the medium-term financial plan starts off with the 2024-25 revenue budget. So that's the budget that we've just been looking at approving in the previous paper. So we've had option 1 approved as part of that paper. So we can just look at the top section of this table to look at the assumptions that we've made going forwards over the following 3 years. So as you can see in that table, we've got 2.99% precept for the first year of the plan, and we've then dropped that down to 1.99% thereafter. So that's lower than the referendum limit we had this year. But prior to the £5 referendum limit that we had in 23-24, the referendum limit was around 2%. So we are just dropping that back down to be prudent, because we don't know what's going to happen in future, and we know there's a general election in 2024. So the kind of fire funding is unknown. So we've done that to be prudent. In terms of council tax base, the 1.8% is shown in there for 2024-25. Again, because we talked about Bristol City Council skewing that a little bit with their quite large increase in council tax base, we have dropped that down to 0.5%, which is a more prudent assessment of kind of what we would expect to see on a normal basis. The revenue support grant, we've got 6.7% for the first year, which is where Claire talked about CPI for the previous September. We've assumed 3% for the following years based on our assessment of where we think CPI will be going forwards. And then any other funding and income stream, we've assumed 0% increase year on year, again in the interest of being prudent. In terms of expenditure assumptions, so if we move over to page 92 and the table at the top of that page, We can just look at pay and non-pay assumptions. So pay assumptions, we've got 4% pay award for 24-25. We've dropped that down to 2% thereafter. We have a fire finance network and a network with other fire authorities, and that is the sector kind of average assumption for the medium-term financial plans this year. In terms of non-pay cost inflation, we've assumed that stays at 3% for the 4-year period. And then the other assumption that's important to note for expenditure is detailed in paragraph 5.8, so that's around the cost of capital financing. This is the line that will change as a result of the capital programme potentially changing, but the key assumption won't change, it'll just be the numbers that we're applying that to. So we have assumed a cost of capital of 8%, which is broken down into two elements. So the first element is the interest element of that borrowing, so we're assuming an interest element of 4%. Our current loans with the Public Works Loan Board are around 3% interest. And currently Public Works Loan Board interest rates is around 5%. So we're going for something slightly lower, but not as low as what we've achieved in the past. When we come onto the Treasury Management paper, there is a forecast of interest rates within there, which shows that they're forecasting the rate to drop to around that kind of level. So we're hoping that 4% is a prudent assumption of the kind of interest that we will achieve on the borrowing. And the other element to make up the 8% is the minimum revenue provision. And again, we talk about that a little bit more in the Treasury Management paper, but it's effectively our contribution to the capital repayment of the borrowing, and we're assuming that at 4% as well, and that's linked to the life of the assets that we are borrowing to fund, and suggesting that on average those assets have a life of around 25 years. And although we're not going to present the capital programme today, that's linked to the fact that a lot of our capital programme is around premises which have long lives. So that's where we get the 8%, and we can see when we look at the appendix that that's quite a significant number over the 4-year period because of the increase in the borrowing that we're expecting. Final point to note in terms of assumptions, and it's mentioned in paragraph 5.9, is just around the HMIC FRS costs. So we mentioned the £440,000 that we've specifically put aside to enable us to deliver against our action plan. It's just to note that that is a one-off contribution. So it's not necessary that we're going to spend it all in 2024-25. We can put it into an earmarked reserve and it will be available if we haven't spent it all during the next financial year, but we are not assuming any further contributions into that. So if we move on to Appendix 1, which is on page 95 of your papers. We don't really need to look at Appendix 2 now. So Appendix 2 was the option of the medium-term financial plan should we have approved option 2 of the 0%. So this option here is based on option 1 having been approved, so 2.99% precept for 2024-25. The key lines really to look at are right at the bottom and within other costs. So the top line there, capital financing costs, that's the line that will change as we change the capital programme. So we'll amend that and represent that to you next time. And efficiency savings is the other line to look at. So we've talked about the £625,000 efficiency saving requirement for 2024-25, and we can see that growing to over 4 million by the end of the 4-year period. So it is a significant amount of money. It has grown when compared to the previous medium-term financial plan that was presented and approved. And a lot of that is down to the capital financing costs. So in the previous medium-term financial plan and capital programme, we didn't include the full cost of the Bath and Western refurbishments, which are now being proposed to be included, which is why that cost is going up significantly. So in order to balance the budget, we've got significant efficiency savings to make over the 4-year period. The final section, just to mention, is section 6 of your paper, so starting on page 92, and it's just talking about the risks. I've kind of mentioned them as I've gone along, but key risks around funding assumptions. We only get a single-year settlement. We don't know what funding is going to be like. We've tried to build this budget based on prudent assumptions to give a view of a realistic view of what we think the next 4 years might look like. But obviously there are risks around those assumptions. There are a lot of unknowns there. I think that's all I wanted to say on the medium-term financial plan, so only open up to any questions.
Yeah. No hand grenades, no cats among pigeons, I promise. Just clarification for my understanding. In the table on Appendix 1, we've got income at the top, and it's local authorities and then central government. And then a couple of lines down, there's other grants, which is 8.6 odd million. What's that other grants? Is that not from central government?
It is from central government, but they're not guaranteed grants. So it's the difference between funding, which is what we get as part of our funding settlement, and grants, which are what they pay us on a one-off basis and could actually come out at any time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's it.
Any other comments, questions? No.
So I think the recommendation's now changed, bearing in mind the line in the appendix. So you're asked to just note the 4-year medium-term financial plan as detailed in the report, and we will represent that appendix to you with revised figures for the next March meeting. So no need for you to vote on the noting. Thank you.
Okay, moving on. And we're taking out item 10, right? Right, and where's item?
Page 125.
Right, I'm not on that one. Okay, having sorted out my papers now, we're on page 125. That helps to update.
And I think Statutory Finance Officer again, Verity, is going to present this paper on Treasury Management.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is the last one today then. I do apologise, this is quite a long one in terms of papers and amounts to read. So I will try to just pull out the key points rather than going through it in lots of detail because there is a lot of information there. Before I start, there's another typo that I just wanted to draw your attention to. On page 137, just so we can have it recorded in the minutes, there's a second table which is showing the brought forward borrowing, adding the new borrowing and showing the carried forward borrowing at the end. That 28,636 is not the total borrowing. That is the new borrowing. So it should read 35,636. So it should add the 7 million brought forward in there as well. So just to note that for the minutes. So this paper brings to you a number of things. It brings to you the Treasury Management Strategy, the Treasury Management Practices, the MRP Policy Statement, and also the Prudential and Treasury Management Indicators. The Treasury Management Strategy is something that's been built upon the previous strategy, so we set a strategy every year. What we've also done is incorporated the approaches and practices that Bristol City Council adopt as part of their Treasury Management activity, because we have a financial services agreement with them in place, and they undertake a number of our treasury management functions for us on our behalf. And then in a similar way, we're publishing for the first time our treasury management practices. So this is something that SIPA recommend we publish to define our powers within treasury management and the scope of our treasury management activities. We haven't previously published one as a fire authority. We haven't published our own practices. And I think on the assumption that Bristol City Council do a lot of our work for us in terms of treasury management, so we kind of adopted theirs. We've published our own for your approval today. SIPFA allows for the monitoring of those practices and the review of those practices to be delegated to Section 151 officers. So that's part of the recommendations today. And then what we can do is just bring those back to you periodically when there's any significant changes to be approved. So it won't necessarily form part of the Treasury Management papers every year. So the bundle might be slightly smaller next year. In terms of recommendations, there are 4 recommendations today. So it's approving the strategy, approving the practices, approving the minimum revenue provision statement, and the final one is approving the prudential and treasury management indicators. I think we're going to have to amend that one to noting because they are heavily linked to the capital programme. So the numbers in there will change. So we'll have to represent those to you in March as well. So if I move on to section 3 and a bit of background, I just wanted to kind of pull out the information in paragraph 3.2, so just around the work that Bristol City Council do for us in terms of treasury management, and just to kind of reiterate that Bristol City Council don't have any responsibility for our treasury management activities, our practices and our policies. That responsibility lies with us, even though we have this financial services contract in place. And we also don't engage with a specific advisor or consultant for treasury management at this point in time. Bristol City Council don't undertake that role for us. And if we did want to have some specific advice on treasury management activities, so either investing or borrowing, we would look to engage our own specialist in order to do that. So section 4 of this report shows the capital programme, which again, we'll amend slightly depending on the outcome of changes to the capital programme as a result of the proposal from the revenue budget paper. So a lot of the numbers within this are linked to that capital programme, but we will look at revising those. So moving on to paragraph 5.1, this lists on page 127, this lists 5 things that are deemed to be required for effective treasury management. So there's a treasury management statement, a treasury management policy statement, a treasury management strategy, a treasury management policy statement, the treasury management practices, the minimum revenue provision statement, and then the prudential and treasury management indicators. So those are all part of the papers that we're presenting for you here today. So I wanted to move on to the treasury management strategy to start with. So page 129 of your bundles is where that starts. It is quite long, so I'm going to try to just pick out the key points. So you might have noticed I said there were 5 things that were required for effective Treasury management practice, but we've only got 4 appendices, and that's because the Treasury management policy statement is embedded within the strategy. So you can see that on page 2 of the strategy, which is page 130 of your bundles, so just to draw your attention to that. And then moving on to page 131 of your bundles, which is page 3 of the strategy, I just wanted to pick out the reporting requirements because there are some slight changes that you'll see as we come into the 24-25 financial year. So paragraph 10, A, is what we're doing today, so approving the Treasury Management Strategy and looking at the indicators. But B and C are things that we haven't previously done, so a mid-year Treasury Management Report and then an annual Treasury Management Report. Those will be brought to the Fire Authority during the 2024-25 financial year, so there'll be additional papers for you upcoming. And then paragraph 12 just talks about quarterly reports. These won't be additional papers. This will be embedded within our existing quarterly financial monitoring reports. So we have capital and revenue monitoring reports going to Policy and Resources Committee at the moment. So any Treasury management reporting required on a quarterly basis will come through those papers. So it won't be additional papers. And SIPVA acknowledges that this reporting can be done on a by exception basis. So it might be that you don't have there might not be anything added to those papers, but just to kind of inform you that there could be some additional information coming to you in those quarterly reports as well. Paragraph 25 of the paper, which is on page 133 of your bundles, just talks about what Bristol City Council do for us in terms of managing our bank account and how our bank account is pooled with their bank accounts, and they invest our money as part of the investments they do of the overall council accounts and the kind of return we get on that investment. So they ensure that we have our bank account balances available to us at any point in time, but they do give us a return for the kind of investment work they do on our behalf. And then moving on to the prudential indicators. So there are some capital prudential indicators which are described on page 134 of the paper. So these are the ones that are going to be heavily linked to the capital programme. So the first one is capital expenditure. So that one will change based on how our capital programme looks in future years. But it's just looking at what we are going to be spending or what we're expecting to be spending over the next 3 years. And then the authorities need to borrow. So our capital financing requirement is looking at anything that we've not yet paid for, either from revenue or capital resources. So it's effectively what do we need to borrow in order to fund that capital programme. Again, that will change slightly depending on what the capital programme looks like, but it includes things like the PFI as well in there. There's a new indicator that's been published by us for the first time this year, which is the liability benchmark. So if we look at Appendix 4, which is right at the back of your packs, page 195. There are 2 pages or 2 sides to this appendix. It's on the second side, there's a graph. So that's an indicator that we haven't published previously. But that indicator is effectively there to tell us how well our existing loans match our borrowing needs. So we have got a relatively simple structure in terms of our investment and borrowing. So we've got, at the moment, currently £7 million worth of borrowing, which is that black straight line shown on the graph. We don't have any specific investments, and that makes the graph a little bit more simple. But the aim of this graph is to compare what your existing loan looks like with what your loan requirement looks like, to see whether, when you need to take out new loans, or whether at any point in time you've got excess cash that you might be able to invest. So ours is relatively simple and doesn't necessarily tell us anything that we didn't already know, because we know that we're going to need to borrow because we haven't got sufficient funds to fund the capital programme. But that's a new one that's published for the first time this year. There's an affordability prudential indicator as well, which looks at the ratio of financing costs to net revenue budget. And as we've talked about briefly in some of the other papers, those financing costs are going up significantly as a result of the investment that we're proposing to make over the coming 3 years, which means that is quite an important prudential indicator for us to monitor over the coming years, because we're going to be seeing those financing costs putting more pressure on our revenue budget, which we've seen in that medium-term financial plan. So that's one that we're looking at in more detail. And when, obviously we didn't present the capital paper, but within the capital strategy it talks about setting a limit for what we don't, and we've set a limit of 6%, so we don't want that indicator to exceed 6%, and that's something that we'll be looking at. Prudential indicators can be revised at any point in time, but they need to be reapproved by the Fire Authority, so that's the kind of thing that might come up in your quarterly reports if we're getting close to that limit for any reason, or if we wanted to change that limit. It's the kind of thing that would come back to the authority for approval. Minimum revenue provision strategy. So this starts at the bottom of page 135 of your bundles. I mentioned briefly earlier the minimum revenue provision, how it's your contribution from the revenue budget to repay the capital of any of your borrowing over a period of time. So there is an overriding principle that your minimum revenue provision has to be prudent. So as long as you can prove it's prudent, it's a legitimate way to provide for your capital repayments. There are published standard calculations, and we are adopting or proposing to adopt a standard calculation, and that's presented in Appendix 3 to your papers, which is on page 193. So this minimum revenue provision statement just details the calculation that we'd be adopting for any borrowing prior to April 2008 and then any borrowing post-April 2008. So any borrowing we are proposing to take out as part of funding the capital programme over the next 3 years will be, the minimum revenue provision will be calculated based on the asset life method. So the life of the asset that borrowing is used to purchase will determine how much we provide for in our revenue budget. It touches briefly on finance leases and PFI because they are part of long-term liabilities, and we have to have an element of minimum revenue provision for them based on the payments and the annual charges that are the annual charges each year. And then the last section of this statement just talks about how we are allowed to make voluntary overpayments to our minimum revenue provision. We haven't done that in the past, and based on our revenue budget and the proposed medium-term financial plan, we're not proposing to do that over the coming 4-year period, but it's there as an option should we ever have sufficient funds in our revenue budget to do so. So that statement is presented there for approval today, and that will then dictate how we calculate our minimum revenue provision over the next 12 months. Then if we move on to some of the other indicators which come into the borrowing section. So page 137 of the strategy, it's page 9 of the strategy, but 137 of your bundles. There's a couple of treasury management indicators in there. So there's one called the operational boundary for external debt. So this is the indicator you set, which is the amount of debt that you do not expect to exceed. So you don't expect to take out any more debt than this, and it's heavily linked to your capital financing requirement or your need to borrow. So we're saying our capital programme looks like this. We need to borrow a certain amount to fund that capital programme, and that is going to be our operational boundary. We're not really expecting to exceed that limit. So when you look at the indicators, you can see that our operational boundary is set exactly equal to our capital financing requirement in Appendix 4. But what we also have is something called the authorised limit, which is talked about at the top of the following page in paragraph 51, which is a legal limit that we cannot exceed. So we give ourselves £1 million headroom. So over and above that operational limit, we add £1 million and have an authorised limit there. So you can see that again published in the prudential indicators. Those might change slightly depending on how the capital programme changes, but the principle of the calculation will remain unchanged. There are some sections within this strategy which talk about prospects for interest rates and borrowing rates. I mentioned those briefly when we were looking at Public Works Loan Board and the assumption on borrowing at 4%. So you can see a table at paragraph 53 which looks at what Public Works loan borrowing rates are expected to do over the next 4 years. That information has come from Bristol City Council's advisors. So they have Treasury Management advisors, and that information has been fed into our strategy as well. And there's a section towards the end of the strategy which gives the economic forecast that they've provided. In terms of borrowing strategy, the key point to note, so at the bottom of page 11 of the strategy is paragraph 65, and it talks about the timing and duration of this borrowing. So that's something that we need to be really mindful of in terms of when we take the borrowing out and for how long, to make sure that we make the most of the kind of interest rates that are available at the time. And when I mentioned earlier, we don't have at the moment existing Treasury Management advisors specifically. This is a kind of area that maybe as borrowing becomes as the need to borrow comes closer, we might engage in advisors to ensure that we're making the right decisions around that. Paragraph 67, it's quite a long paragraph and talks about how we would prioritise the kind of debt that we're taking out. So I won't go in detail, but it's just talking about the kind of order that we would look at, the types of debt that we would look at when we're looking at borrowing over the coming years. There's only a couple more areas in the strategy, I promise, that, to go through. So the annual investment strategy starts on page 14. This, I won't talk about in much detail because given that we're looking to borrow, we're running down our capital reserve, we're running down our bank balances, we're not planning to make any specific, or not expecting to have sufficient cash in our bank account to make any specific fixed-term investments. But this is included within the strategy in case something changes, and it dictates the kind of institutions that we can invest with, the kind of quality and credit ratings they need to have, the limits that we put on the type of investments we invest in and the duration. So it includes all of that. The most important thing to note in here is that SIPVA tells us the kind of priorities we need to put on our investments. So paragraph 77 on page 142 says that we have to make sure we prioritise security of our investment first, followed by liquidity and then yield. So whilst yield is what you invest to get a return, that has to be the final, your lower priority in terms of making an investment. And then the very last thing I wanted to just pull out in the strategy is at the bottom of page 19 of the strategy, or page 147 of your bundles, there's a table there, and it's actually the bottom section of that table, which is a maturity structure of debt. That's a new prudential indicator as well, that's published on the second page of Appendix 4. And that's just going to be more important for us as we take on more debt over the coming years, because it's looking at making sure that we have a good spread of maturity across our loans. So we're not taking all of our loans out with the same duration maturing at the same time, and that puts pressure on us to pay them back. So that just sets limits around how we spread that borrowing. So that's kind of the end of the strategy, and that covered Appendix 3 with the minimum revenue provision statement and then also the prudential indicators. But the final bit that we need to look at is the Treasury management practices. So Appendix 2 of this paper, so page 157, I'm not going to go through in detail because it is a long document, but the purpose of this document is to detail the schedules that support the kind of practices that we have in place, the controls and procedures we have in place to address each of the 12 Treasury management practices that SIPFA identify. We have used Bristol City Council's Treasury management practices to help us prepare this document because there are elements that they complete for us. So as you read through the document, it should be clear where there's elements that are done on our behalf by Bristol City Council and then elements that we're responsible for ourselves. So that one's there for approval today, and then it will be represented when there's any significant change. And then I think that's everything I wanted to cover on that paper, so it's just if there's any questions. That was the worst one, wasn't it?
Okay, I've got Richard and then David
and Councillor May. So
That's
I
right.
think Richard, you might have been first.
I think Richard just got there first.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for that, Verity. Very thorough. I was just going to ask about the Public Work Loan Board. Obviously, do you find that's the best place to go most times? It seems to be the sort of message we get from a council level. It's all underwritten, safer, and obviously you're dealing with public money. I just wonder what your take on it was from our side.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we do, as being member of, there's a certain membership we have, which means that we get a slightly advantageous rate with Public Works Loan Board as well. So I think that's why it becomes our the first place we look. But as we're going to look for borrowing, we would always explore, because it could be that another local authority has got some excess cash and they could lend it to us at a lower rate, for example. So it's something that we would look at. But I think Public Works Loan Board is, that might be optimistic, but...
Next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Verity, for making that report relatively accessible for lay people. I've got some questions about the table on page 134. The capital expenditure proposals. The 500k that's in 24-25, is that the same 500k that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, that is the same 500,000. So had we presented the capital programme paper for you today, that is the capital programme that would have been presented for approval. So this is just replicated here because it really feeds into our borrowing need. But that's going to change depending on how we look at that 500,000.
I just wanted to make that plain to everybody, so I think that's important. The other question I've got about this graph is that there are lots of spending to do with premises that are heavily loaded into 3 years in the future. Now, one thing I have learned about being a councillor for 3 years is that any proposals for building stuff that you project are going to be wrong in 3 years. Is there any chance of either bringing that spending forward so that we can actually make sure that we're spending the right amount of money at the right time and have the right proposals in place, or I'm assuming that this is going to be for the Bath fire station and the Western fire station rebuilds. So can we actually bring some of that spending forward so that we actually have the correct figures?
Yeah, I think Andrew can come in on that one.
Yeah, so we're bringing, it is primarily for Bath and Western, which, as you know, has been in our estate strategy for quite some time. We are bringing those papers in July. This is at the moment based on what when we feel that we can actually go to build, because there's a lot of pre-work to be done from that. And also what we need to do is make sure that we're not trying to resource two big projects at the same time. But we can certainly, when we bring the paper in July to PRC, look at the different options around kind of timings.
I think that would be very useful, thank you.
The challenge of bringing it forward know, Councillor, is obviously we've got to be able to pay for those loans as well, so we'd have to find efficiencies to be able to balance the budget, really.
Paul?
Thank you, Chair. On paragraph 51, you can breathe now, by the way. Paragraph 51, the legal limit. What is the legal limit in terms of borrowing in millions?
For us, so that's presented in Appendix 4. So we set that limit ourselves, and
Right.
it's driven by the capital programme. So there are limits presented in Appendix 4, which mine has fallen off the back. So we have got, for example, in 24-25, we've got a limit of just under 11.5 million. Having said that, those are the numbers that will change slightly depending on how we change the capital programme as a result of the proposal earlier today. So, yeah, page 195 of your bundle, you have got some prudential indicators, and you can see the authorised limit there. So we set our own authorised limit, and it's a limit then that we are legally required to stay within.
We set that in terms of our affordability and revenue terms.
Yeah.
But there's no legal requirement on the fire authority.
Not that I'm aware of. It might be something. Yeah, so I think we set our own limit and work within it rather than having one imposed on us. Yeah.
And the reference to PFI, which is getting really quite a bad reputation, I'm really quite nervous that we might go into PFI moving forward in terms of the long-term borrowing. And the other question I've looked everywhere to see whether there's an ethical dimension to the borrowing that we do. We've quite clearly said we'll just go for the lowest rate we can find, but is there any ethical dimension to that we should be aware of?
There is, so we are required to start looking at ethical principles with borrowing and investment, but there's not any specific guidance on it at the moment, which is why it's not in here as part of the strategy, because we haven't been given that kind of a bit more detail on that, but that's something that's due to be coming in. And I think in the very beginning of the paper there is a slight mention to ethical considerations are made in terms of investments and borrowing, but it is a very minimal reference. It's very minimal. But I think in future we probably will have to have some sort of ethical policy, but we just haven't been given the information and the detail yet in terms of what that's expected to look like.
So can we put that down as an action point from this meeting today?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And PFI?
I don't think there are plans to look at new PFI arrangements, but I don't know if Simon can...
No, not at the moment. Of course, we've got Severn Park, which is a PFI arrangement which comes to an end in 2028, April 2028, which will soon fall into our considerations in our medium-term financial plan around. We're currently exploring what the options are in relation to that particular building. Moreover, the facilities it affords us as opposed to the building itself, because it is one of our main training venues for our operational training. And of course, if in some way, shape or form we don't retain that capability, we have to make arrangements to replace that. And again, that will then fall into capital borrowing and the overall capital programme also. But we're just looking at we've got a small project running at the moment in relation to the end of the PFI 2028 and what that might look like in terms of our options, which we previously brought to members to explore the potential to take on that building post the PFI. And so what we're looking at now is what are the cost implications of that, what is our commitments that are needed, etc. And also the resourcing necessary, such as TUPE arrangements for existing staff.
Sorry, a quick question. Councillor May's just brought up our ethical policy, and that there's not one in here at present, although there's a small line. Obviously, seeing that Bristol City Council do provide Treasury Management Services, and obviously we work quite closely with Bristol City, do we sort of get it through the back door in terms of any way that they process their own in-house management services that actually they might be using the same system when dealing with us? So obviously they're going to have their considerations, because I think Bristol City Council members might shut me down now, but I think every council locally does have a ethical strategy. So I'm just wondering where we probably do have one, but it's just through the back door and it's not actually presented within our own papers.
Yeah, absolutely. So anything that Bristol City Council do on our behalf in terms of investments would follow their process. So if they've got an ethical policy, it would be something that our investments would follow. So in terms of our bank account and what they do in terms of cash pooling and investing overnight and things like that, if there's anything ethical there, that would our investments would follow. If we were going to invest on a specific fixed term, say we thought we had a spare bit of money and we were going to invest it for a fixed term period of time, they would do that on our instruction. So they wouldn't necessarily follow the same process, because they wouldn't just go ahead and invest specifically on our behalf without us telling them to.
Any other comments, questions?
Thank you for presenting this very long paper. I just got like a few questions in terms of like paragraph 39, minimum revenue provision strategy. So the first one, are there any consequences for not meeting the requirements of the compulsory minimum revenue provisions?
Sorry, can you just say that again? Sorry.
Are there any consequences for not meeting the requirements of the compulsory minimum revenue provision?
I imagine, I mean, we have to legally provide for this, don't we? So I'll let...
So that would be raised by our auditors if we weren't to actually follow that piece of, and we would have to declare that as part of our annual audit process that we've gone outside of the SIPFA guidelines on that particular area. So it may not be, there wouldn't actually be any sanction on us, but it would certainly be noted as part of an audit. And also, I suppose, from the other perspective, the reason for that minimum revenue provision is so that we can then repay the borrowing when it comes due. So if we weren't actually making that minimum revenue provision, then there would be a risk around the payment of those loans when they get to the end of their term. So.
Thank you. And my second question is, how does the authority prioritize between compulsory and voluntary payments toward the accumulated journal fund capital?
So in terms of voluntary minimum revenue provision contributions?
Yeah, so how we like sort of prioritize between compulsory and a volunteer?
So compulsory are included within our assumptions, so in our capital financing costs that we've assumed in both the single year revenue budget and then the medium term financial plan. We haven't assumed anything in terms of voluntary because we don't really have the scope within our revenue budget to do so. But we can do if we wanted to. And what that would do is effectively give you a holiday in future years. If you had a year where you thought your revenue budget was quite healthy, you could put a little bit of money aside towards the repayment of the capital of your loans. It might help you in future years. If you had a year where you were struggling, you might be able to reduce your minimum revenue provision slightly.
Thank you.
Okay, any more comments, questions before we move to voting on this?
If we can quickly remind ourselves of the recommendation. So on page 125 of your bundle, members, it says the Fire Authority is asked to approve the Treasury Management Strategy for 2024-25 to 26-27, Appendix 1, approve the Treasury Management Practices at Appendix 2, and delegate monitoring of these practices to the Statutory Finance Officer. C, approve the minimum revenue provision statement 24-25 at Appendix 3, and then Verity amended the recommendation at D. So instead of approve, is now note the prudential and treasury management indicators at Appendix 4. So if you're happy, can we take those recommendations on one vote? So can I have a proposer, please? Ben, thank you. And a seconder? Thank you, Councillor May. Everybody is willing, thank you. Any votes against? Any abstentions? Votes in favour? Thank you. Super.
Great. It's been an interesting morning. I think we're on the last bit now, though. Yeah. Okay, we're on to item 12, which is Fire Authority meeting dates 2024-25, and I think the clerk's going to tell you what they are.
Members, thank you. Yes, it's my paper. It's at page 197 of your bundle. It's a very short paper, and you'll be delighted to hear that I'm not going to read it to you. It's basically just setting out a table, which is on page 198 of your bundle, at paragraph 5.1, of the meeting dates that we've provisionally set for the 24-25 municipal year. There are certain dates we have zero flexibility with. So your AGM, we're told it has to be held within a month of the AGMs of the unitary authorities, and the budget meeting has to be held at a certain date in February to meet the deadline for giving the figures to the UAs. So apart from that, Emma's done an excellent piece of work on this, because we have to try and deconflict millions of dates from all your unitary authorities, from all the officers. It's almost the impossible job. You can't please everyone. So we've done our best. I don't intend to go through it. We are going to try to continue to move meetings around. I'm looking at possible venues, I think in Weston-super-Mare and in Bath, because I'm just conscious that some of you travel more than others, and it doesn't feel fair at the moment. So I'm doing my best. It is very difficult, because you find the perfect venue and it charges too much, or it's booked, or it doesn't have enough capacity. So it's not that we're not trying, we are trying. But anyway, if you have any concerns about those dates, please could you let me know, because I have an opportunity to re-look at these dates again. I hope we don't need to, and they're set in the diary, so we will be sending out diary invites. But at the AGM is another opportunity when I can update meeting dates if there's a need. Any questions or comments, please? No?
Can I suggest, if anybody knows of a good venue that's relatively easy to get to, very, very cheap, so we
good
can
parking,
save money.
Good parking.
Good parking. Access, not too near to the motorway. Please do let us know. Okay,
Are you willing to propose?
Yeah, I'll propose the dates. Can I have a seconded? Ben's seconded.
Ben, thank you.
Right. Everybody okay with those?
Those in favour?
Yeah.
Super. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, it's been a bit of a marathon today, I know. I'm sorry about this, but yeah, interesting. So we've got the next meeting on the 20th of March at 2 o'clock, and that'll be at HQ in Portishead.
And the agenda for that will be tweaked to include coming back on the budget and also adding the capital programme. Thank you very much, members. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.